Chapter 22. Mateo stood atop the Eliza of the giver La Principessa, a spell concealing him from sight. Instead of his usual rotating transformative magic, he settled on one persona for now. The lack of magical pull was a relief. Despite a day of rest and strategizing with Mateo and Vittoria, he still felt drained. But this couldn't wait, and his energy had been replenished enough. The sun sank in the distant sky, replaced by shadows from the other side of the world. Necci lay mostly in quiet, except for muffled shouts to the northwest, then a scream, and then another. Vittoria stood next to him in her creamy cape, a magnolia flower rustling behind her left ear. "Romeo is attacking?" she asked. "Yes, the East End Covens now. They moved through Necci Coven last night. Our spies tell us that Romeo received information that East End witches participated in the attack, but I think he's just using that as an excuse. He'll punish each coven, if you ask me. Let's go somewhere closer. I know a spot we can observe from." Banat and his men had stashed several crates of supplies that La Principessa could give to the workers once Romeo's raid ceased, and not just food, clean rags, soap, potions. As expected, Romeo had allowed the day to proceed with little action, but that truce had ended just before twilight. Workers in the East End Coven foolish enough to be in the main alleys were crying out in fear. Such purges had happened before. Guardians were doubtless marching through the alleys, setting new pikes and seeking any witches still on the road. They'd pounce from the shadows to take rebels away to the Vincela, a special prison in the middle of the Saltu. If any rebel or worker could escape from its magic, they died in the jungle. If they didn't escape, they'd rot in a cell until they died of neglect or in mass execution. The worst offenders, like landowners who sided with workers, ended up in carcere, a special prison on an island down the coast. Mateo reached over, grabbed Vittoria's wrist, and gave it a little squeeze. With a quick spell, he transported them to another Eliza in the East End Coven, La Cristiana. This was much smaller. 2 stories, dilapidated stone. It had once been a small shop. When the second-story floor fell through, landowners abandoned it and the workers moved in. It was a quiet place amid the stench of the East End Coven, where the air always smelled like refuse and rot. Mateo stood on top of the Eliza, still concealed, with only Vittoria's warmth at his side. Banat followed. Mateo kept a firm hand on Vittoria's arm, while he maintained his invisibility spell. She cast her own invisibility spell and held it well enough, though her feet and hair sometimes slipped past the magic. Not being able to see one's own body was disorienting. Not seeing it while standing at great heights would likely dizzy her, but she remained quiet at his side. Still, he kept a hand on her, just in case. Bursts of light came from the road of La Emanuela. The magical fire would be from the Guardians, likely meant to disorient a group of witches or illuminate an alley so they could take them to prison or pike them. "I must get closer. Stay out of sight on the rooftops, but follow me. You'll know when you need to act." "We will," Banat said from somewhere behind him. "Be safe," Vittoria replied. Mateo took 2 steps back, ran, and leaped onto the stone roof of another building, then dropped to a staircase tucked into an alley just off the road of La Emanuela. As he'd expected, chaos unfurled in the streets. Guardians swept down the road in groups of 5. Workers had already scrambled to whatever holes they could find. He thought he heard a whimper below the stairs. One glance down confirmed that 3 children were huddling together. The oldest had his arms around 2 young girls. He stared at Mateo in undisguised fear when Mateo dropped the invisibility spell. Mateo shook his head once, conjured the blowing glue sign of La Salvatorra above his palm, and winked. The little boy's face contorted with relief. Mateo extinguished the sign and murmured, "Stay here until you've counted to 100, then take the back alleys until you find your home again. I will put a spell over all 3 of you that will keep you invisible for 15 minutes. Can you return by then?" The boy nodded. Mateo cast a spell on the children to hide them and moved to the edge of the alley. He grimaced. Each incantation tugged at his already tapped resources, and it made him nervous to go out under one face instead of many. Pikes stood at alternating distances along the road. They'd be filled with heads soon enough at this rate. A shout drew Mateo's attention. He turned to find a circle of 10 guardians. 2 of the regular 5-man patrol groups had come together for something. Only a few steps more brought their voices into range. He kept to the edges of the street, casting spells to hide what witches he found trembling in the shadows. "Kill him," A captain yelled the order. The most a conscripted witch could expect out of military service was to be a foot guardian. The landowners sent all their sons for a stint in the military. The good ones reached the rank of captain or higher. This captain appeared to be somewhat young, maybe 21, when few reached that rank before age 27. Had Hode grown desperate? Why push such young men into leadership? In the middle of the circle of guardians was a young guardian with armor too big for his gangly body. His helmet almost covered his eyes. He couldn't be more than 13. In front of him knelt an even younger worker boy, 11 at most. He had scraggly hair that fell to his shoulders, and dirt caked under his trembling fingernails. Blood stained his clothes in brown and crimson. Conscripted to the butcher's here, no doubt. He'd probably been out on a delivery and returned too late. A sob peeped out of him as he tried to curl into a ball and hide. "Kill him!" the captain yelled again. But, sir," the young guardian squeaked, "it's my brother. He's done nothing wrong. He wasn't at the ballroom." A hard silence fell on the circle of guardians. Mateo didn't bother with the concealing spell as he slowly worked his way around the edge of the circle. He glimpsed the captain in between bodies. For a split second, indecision appeared on the captain's features. He'd already issued a command. He had to force the guardian to see it through or be known as weak. But the other guardians in the circle were young workers forced into the service. They lived in these streets, knew these witches, prayed to the same givers. Could all of them overwhelm him? Possibly, if they pounced fast enough. Mateo glanced above the road to the shadowy sky. A shape moved onto a nearby rooftop and nodded once. A vein popped in the captain's forehead as he finally screamed again. "Kill him or die yourself!" The guardian stared at his brother in horror. I can't," he said to the captain. Tears made his voice wobbly. His knees quaked as he dropped his sword. It clattered against the ground with a damning finality. "I can't kill him." The captain grabbed the guardian by the neck and shoved him down until the boy's forehead slammed into the cobblestones. His sword hissed as he drew it from his scabbard. Dazed, the boy blinked. "Remove your armor," the captain muttered. Another guardian stepped forward to stop the captain, but was held back by a friend. The terrified young guardian fumbled as he pulled off his half-leather, half-metal armor to expose his back. Old scars, silver in the dim torchlight, gleamed off his ribs. The younger brother gaped, eyes wide with tears and horror. "No!" he screamed, a desperate, throaty sound. The captain kicked him. Mateo glanced up to see a definite stir of shadows atop the closest building. A flash of white in the night. He issued a spell as the captain put the tip of his sword against the young guardian's ribcage. "For your insubordination," the captain said. A shocking blue light exploded overhead. The captain winced and held up an arm to shield his eyes. The sword tip dropped into the dirt as one of the guardians cried out. The sign of La Salvatorra floated over the circle. "La Salvatorra!" voices exclaimed. A command rang from the rooftop. "Leave that boy alone." Vittoria stepped into sight in a circle of torchlight that Benat must have cast. Magnolia flower illuminated behind her left ear. As always, she wore a simple dress with no adornments. The bluish glow from the sign of La Salvatorra cast her in an even brighter light. Her elegant ivory cape, so like a magnolia itself, rustled behind her in a gentle breeze. Her expression was firm. 5 of the 10 guardians dropped to their knees with startled cries. From a nearby window came the muffled sob of "La Principessa." "If you value your life," Vittoria said to the captain, "you will leave those boys alone." The captain gritted his teeth. "Pray to your givers," he shouted to the guardians on their knees. "I don't take orders from a woman. Now all of you will die." "Not necessarily," Mateo quipped as he advanced. He kept his eyes on the captain as he withdrew his sword. "Unless you would like to fight La Salvatorra." Murmurs rippled through the circle. Several emotions flickered through the captain's expression under the glow of La Salvatorra's mark. "No?" Mateo tisked. "Well, that's a shame. Those pikes are waiting for a head, aren't they?" Mateo issued a spell. Ropes snaked around the captain's hands. Another spell forced him to his knees. "Traitor!" the captain finally sputtered. "You will see justice for this." Mateo smiled. "Correct. That is what I am, is it not? And that is La Principessa, giver of hope. I suggest you remember that we work together in defense of workers, and you have been found guilty this night." The captain attempted to overpower Mateo's magic and free himself from the ropes around his wrists, but Mateo silenced him with a knock to the side of his head. He fell unconscious to the cobblestones. From down the road, another patrol of guardians marched toward them. No doubt they'd seen the sign of La Salvatorra. Mateo had only a few moments before they would go invisible and spring into an attack. "I want no harm to come to this captain," Vittoria said. "He will be handled according to justice demands. If the network is to unite, we must stop the senseless killing and trust the givers." Astonished murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mateo mentally tipped a hat to her cleverness. "The givers have come," another guardian exclaimed. "Our prayers are coming true." Benat's men would transport the captain to the Vincela tonight and stash him in a cell. The guardians there would find him in the morning or the next day, whenever the feeding schedule allowed it. Wallowing in a prison cell in the Saltu might give him some humility. The two young boys would be offered a chance to join Benat's men. "Salvation has come." A witch leaned out of a nearby window. "La Principessa and La Salvatorra are with us." Mateo bowed, gallantly sliding into his role as the somewhat extravagant giver. The larger-than-life personality sometimes confused or distracted the guardians, allowing Benat and his men to more easily do their hidden work. It also firmly separated La Salvatorra from Mateo. The footfalls of the oncoming guardians sounded on the stone now. More witches spoke from the houses, the alleys. They spilled onto nearby rooftops as they emerged from hiding and dropped to a knee while facing Vittoria. The guardian reinforcements moved more quickly now, but they were a smaller group than when they'd started. Behind them, Mateo thought he saw guardians kneeling on the road. No time to wait. Mateo grabbed the two boys by their arms. They hardly had time to gasp in surprise before he summoned all the magic he could pull out of his body and transported them away. He could only take them to the rooftop behind Vittoria where they wouldn't be seen. Once there, he collapsed under the strain. He'd never transported two before, hadn't been positive it was possible, but was gratified that all his years of magical work were paying off. Benat appeared next to them. He rested a hand over the mouth of the youngest and motioned for them to be quiet. Wide-eyed, they both nodded. In front of them, Vittoria stood silhouetted against the mark of La Salvatorra. "Peace is all that I ask," she said to those on the street. "It's all we want. Of my workers, I demand respect for our desire for peace. Bring no harm to the guardians. Guardians, leave now with your lives. If we cannot respect each other and come to understand that we are all witches, no peace will be possible." Mateo motioned Benat back to Vittoria with a jerk of his head. Benat disappeared under a concealing spell. He'd work any required magic in Mateo's place now. Just a regular night for La Salvatorra. Mateo distracted guardians by being La Salvatorra, and Benat and his men used stealth and magic to save whomever they could. A moment of silence fell over the scene in the wake of Vittoria's words. Mateo struggled to his feet, exhausted already, and moved closer to the edge of the building. The newly arrived captain struggled to know what to do when the other captain disappeared without warning, transported away by one of Benat's concealed men. "You have 10 seconds to leave with your lives, guardians," Vittoria cried, "or you'll see La Salvatorra's justice on your own heads." Benat's men lurked unseen in the shadows. The guardians, too distracted to feel for magic in use, wouldn't see an attack coming if they tried to press this. Finally, the captain barked, "Guardians, return to your posts, now!" "Leave those guardians who have shown obedience to me," Vittoria demanded. Her voice didn't waver, not for a moment. The guardians who had taken a knee remained in their spots in silence. Some of them trembled and stared at the road. Reluctantly, the rest filed away. Benat murmured a command to 3 of his men, who nodded and disappeared. One of them reappeared in the middle of the remaining guardians and began to speak to them. Mateo stepped forward. Workers still watched from windows, alleys, storefronts, and hidden nooks. "I am La Salvatorra. For the last 10 years I have worked among you. Now, La Principessa and I are here to bring you hope and justice. You are not alone." Muted cries followed. The sound of more screams, the stench of smoke, and the crackle of magic came from the entrances to the East End Coven. Mateo glanced that way, then pointed to Joska in the circle. "This is Joska. If you follow him, you'll be safe. You need not return to Hode's service." With that, the burning blue light faded. Once it was gone, Mateo collapsed wearily. In the darkness, Vittoria retreated out of sight of the street. Bernat appeared next to him as Vittoria put a hand on Mateo's shoulder. "Can you do this again?" she asked with worry in her gaze. "There are attacks in other parts of Nechi. I can hear them out of the Samsa coven now." He looked at Bernat, who nodded once. "Add the 2 boys to the group of guardians who will be defecting," Mateo said quietly. The 2 boys clutched each other with a mixture of relief and terror. "They'll be fine. So will I. I have the energy we need." Mateo allowed Vittoria to pull him to his feet and ignored her skeptical expression. Her concern eased his mind, and he didn't know why. She put a hand on his face, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she murmured, "for saving them." "It was La Principessa." He brushed a lock of hair out of her face. "You'll make a wonderful High Priestess, Vittoria. Come, let's see what more we can do. We need to let as many workers know of our work together as possible. Word has probably reached Romeo and Hode already." Worry crossed her face. He put a hand on her cheek. "You will be safe from Hode, I promise." Something flashed in her eyes. She nodded. "I trust you." Vittoria followed Mateo down a staircase on the side of the building. They'd use as little magic as possible in their quest to help workers, just to save him the energy. Bernat and one of his men disappeared with the 2 boys. Mateo pulled Vittoria toward the Samsa coven, already alight with fire and screams.